Is this child Black enough to go to this AP calculus class? Do we want segregated schools? Unless the hope is that not only are schools segregated, but neighborhoods are segregated, workplaces are segregated. How far do we allow the concentric circles to grow? People, have been screaming, it's Jim Crow all over again. And I really don't think it is. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel, where we've been discussing American identity, hidden family stories. And I want to talk about an article that I saw yesterday. It's about an Illinois high school that is offering classes separated by race. And obviously, there are a million ways that you could handle this, right? But I don't want to tell you what to think. I want to encourage you to dig into this on your own. So instead of telling you what I think is the right answer, I want to give you 2 reasons why it makes sense and 2 reasons why it doesn't, and let you decide. But before we dive into that, I want you to grab a free download. I'm not going to make you watch through the whole video to get the link to it. I'll tell you right now so you can grab it. If you're interested in saving your family history, in interviewing older family members, in recording family stories, I want you to go to the link in the comments or the description, and you can download a PDF that I put together with a video that I put together that walks you through all of that. So you can go ahead and grab that. So let's dive in to what's going on. So these high school classes are called affinity classes. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And I just want to read a little bit of the article to you. A high school in Evanston, Illinois implemented a program back in 2019 that lets students segregate by race in order to address learning gaps. The program has gained a lot of popularity and has even expanded. Advocates for the program say it can help make students feel more comfortable in the classroom, which increases their chances of doing better in school. This year at Evanston Township High School, nearly 200 Black and Latino students signed up for core classes like math and writing, and in particular AP Calculus is what we're going to discuss today. Those students will attend classes with students of the same race. The so-called affinity classes are taught by a teacher of color intended to help Black or Latino students enroll in advanced curriculum. The school district superintendent, Marcus Campbell, told the school's newspaper that the goal of this was to provide, quote, a different, more familiar setting to kids who feel really anxious about being in AP classes. And those are the advanced placement classes. I took some of those in high school. They give you credit towards college. They're fantastic. While federal anti-discrimination laws ban public schools from mandatory segregation, education lawyers said that the voluntary options for students don't apply. Plus, Evanston isn't the first school to try this. The article says schools in Minnesota, California, and Washington State have also offered race-specific elective classes. Civil rights attorney Robert Patillo argued that the program in Evanston is healthy and enriching for students, making learning feel more comfortable. Now, before I dive into the 2 reasons why it makes sense, possibly, and the 2 reasons possibly why it doesn't make sense, I want to tell you a story. The story is about a man from 1892. His name was Homer Plessy, and he was 1/8 African-American from Louisiana. And if you're not familiar with like the fractional numbers for things like that, that's about 12.5% Black or African-American. And so that's like about my mom would be. And if you saw my mom walking around Louisiana, I don't think you would necessarily like see that part of her identity jump out at you. So he is 1/8 African-American, and he bought a first-class train ticket in Louisiana. Now, under state law at the time, trains had separate cars for people who were considered white and people who were considered colored, right? And so Plessy chose to sit in the white-only car. Now, when he refused to move to the colored car, he was forcibly removed and arrested. Plessy challenged this under the 13th and 14th Amendments, and the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion, held that the 14th Amendment was meant to ensure political equality, not social equality. So basically, the court justified racial segregation in public spaces, including trains, in schools, and theaters. And the idea was, yes, you do need to be treated equally, but that jurisdiction doesn't extend to every sphere of life. We're just talking politically. So that social equality should come naturally in these areas, not through legislation. So it's saying we're not going to force theaters to desegregate. We're not going to force schools to desegregate. So it asserted that the Constitution couldn't enforce social equality if one race was considered socially inferior. And that was really the gist of this argument, was that one group was considered socially inferior, and that is why they were being separated. Justice John Marshall Harlan was the only dissenter during the Supreme Court case in Plessy versus Ferguson. And Harlan said that the Constitution it's colorblind, and there shouldn't be classes within the system of citizens. So he wrote the only dissenting opinion. The rest of the court was saying, yes, separate but equal is equal. So hold that. So the separate but equal doctrine from Plessy versus Ferguson was applied to racial segregation in various social situations, including schools, right? So we had school for people who are considered colored, right? Whatever that means under that umbrella. And then whatever kids were considered white were going to these other schools. So it wasn't until 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education that this doctrine was challenged. So in Brown, African-American children from Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, and Virginia were denied entry to whites-only schools. And they argued that state laws allowing racial segregation violated the 14th Amendment and that segregation could never truly be equal. So the Supreme Court unanimously overruled Plessy during Brown versus the Board of Education. They agreed you can't have separate schools for kids based on how they look and have that be equal treatment. And they said even if the physical facilities of racially segregated schools were equal, so like it's a copy and paste, it's not like they have worse water fountains than these guys, that segregation based solely on race was inherently unequal. So the difference, though, for what's happening in the Illinois school district is that this is not, and this is the argument, that this is self-segregation. So it's something that is okay. It's constitutional because students are choosing to self-segregate. Let's go to people who may support this and what they're saying. Well, what I'm seeing reminds me a lot of the argument for girls-only schools or boys-only schools and male colleges, colleges for men, colleges for women. And it's interesting that, racial segregation has been something where we're like, no, like we can't do this, Jim Crow. But sex segregation has been kind of accepted. Why? And so I was curious if this had ever been brought before the court. Of course it had. We're such a litigious country. We love bringing things to court. It was this idea that it's separate but equal. The Court of Appeals affirmed it, again, saying, okay, like this works for us. They don't have to be in the men's college, but if you have a similar, mirrored experience that women can go to, that you offer, that's good enough for us. But the Supreme Court disagreed when they reviewed this case. We don't need to go into all of that. All of that to say is that the issue has not really been as cut and dry, I think, as we like to think, because there are these other aspects of segregating. And I'm going back now to saying reasons why people might support this now. There's also there's schools that function under religious, separation. Maybe it's a Hebrew school, maybe it's a Christian school. And I don't exactly know what, the standards are for segregating. Are they going to allow non-Hebrew kids into the Hebrew school? I went to a Christian school for a little while. There was definitely non-Christian kids at the Christian school, but these are private schools. They're not receiving state funding. And I think that's the difference. If it's a private thing, then you have a lot more freedom, right? So that is one thing that comes to mind as a support for this, that we kind of already have a system in our education experience where we are kind of segregating people, and we have been kind of okay with it. But the race stuff feels really different. And another reason that I can understand hypothetically why this would make sense is this argument on the comfort and the familiarity and the cultural focus. And so some might argue that students would be more comfortable, in a class of people more like them, maybe reduce instances of discrimination or bullying or just friction, right? Because our society, everything is just, it's like waiting to blow up. And so in these hypothetical scenarios, segregated schools could focus on specific cultural or historic education that's relevant to a particular group. But my issue really with this is that this is an AP calculus class. It's not like we're sitting here and we're talking about, the African diaspora or like, indigenous history. And, they want to create kind of a safe space, so to speak. I really feel like if you're doing AP calculus, you really need to just focus on that. You know what I mean? So now I want to go to 2 reasons why I think this isn't a great idea. So the first reason probably comes no surprise if you've watched my channel. The wording on this says that people who identify as Black, who identify as the self-identification part of this is impossible. Okay, this is impossible. How do we define who gets into these classes? So you're self-identifying as Black is what they're saying. They're not even saying African American, they're saying Black. Okay, so if someone tries to get into this class and the administration doesn't see them as Black, what happens? What does the process look like for proving who you are, or who you say you are? And maybe in this school district, maybe there's not a lot of mixed race people. Maybe it truly is pretty like cut and dry from their point of view. But at some point, this is going to be an issue of who counts. Is this child Black enough to go to this AP calculus class? Well, that's a thing that we really should never be asking, honestly. I don't think that's a great question. So how do we define who can get in? Are we going to require DNA tests? Are we going to have to, do a paper bag test at the door to say, okay, well, you identify as Black, but you haven't really had a Black experience, so we don't want you in here because that doesn't feel like a safe space. What about, there's a million reasons why like that immediately does not really work. Even if in a perfect world, we would like to implement it. How do you implement it? Well, what happened was during Jim Crow, when this was implemented, it was the 1-drop rule, because it ends up going to this place that it kind of removes the humanity from our neighbor, right? It becomes so focused on figuring out what box should they go into. I'm going to leave that there for now. And the second reason, well, there's a couple reasons, but the second reason, let's take this to the logical end. So what if we say, okay, we just are going to self-segregate for these classes. So children can choose to segregate. Well, what if every Black child, every Hispanic child is put into this thing? So now you have a class, a de facto segregation of, who the white kids that are left, whatever that means, right? Maybe they don't fit in because Asian kids aren't fitting into the Black or Hispanic group. So they're going to be lumped in with the white kids. Okay, so let's do that. So everybody's happy about it. Let's say everybody's happy about it. Let's say 50% of people are happy about it. Okay, well, what's the next step? The next step is segregating all the classes. The next step is creating segregated schools. Do we want segregated schools? I think there can be hypothetical benefits to racial segregation in education, just like there's hypothetical benefits to gender segregation in some ways, right? Because it minimizes these friction points. But here's the thing. Those friction points exist, and if kids can't learn how to deal with those as kids in school, it's going to be really difficult to learn how to navigate those difficult situations as adults, unless the hope is that not only are schools segregated, but neighborhoods are segregated, workplaces are segregated. How far do we allow the concentric circles to grow? And then we're talking about, well, it's more comfortable to be with people who are like you. Yeah, I think most of us feel like that, but we also recognize, at least here in the United States, I would hope, how important it is to be around people who are not like you. And that's a beneficial thing for everybody. I want to read, so Frederick Douglass, he spent such a huge part of his messaging, of his life, was talking about segregation and why it was wrong, why he felt it was wrong. And I want to read something from the 1872 edition of the New National Era, which was a publication aimed at people who had been emancipated from slavery. So he's speaking right to these people who have just been freed from slavery, and they're trying to become part of society. And this is what Frederick Douglass said. He said, we want mixed schools, not because our colored schools are inferior to white schools and not because colored instructors are inferior to white instructors, but because we want to do away with a system that exalts one class and debases another. Now, someone may argue that these segregated math classes are not exalting one group and debasing another. And I would say, okay, you're right. Not yet. Not yet. Now, I think that educating children to view themselves and others primarily through the lens of race and to separate themselves and each other based on this criterion is a step in the wrong direction, overarchingly. And I think there is value in acknowledging and celebrating shared experiences with people with similar backgrounds. And I strongly support affinity groups after school. Like, get together with people who like to eat the same food as you and cook it, or listen to the same music, or read the same literature, or join a group. But when we're talking about AP calculus, when we're talking about math, I think that emphasizing racial divisions there in this educational setting can really detract from the sense of community and mutual respect, which we need in this increasingly diverse world that we live in. Our culture is becoming more diverse in a beautiful way, I think. And so I think the reaction to that should be modeling to students, how do we engage with people who are like us? How do we engage with people who don't like us? And there's tension there, people we don't like. How do we respond? And I have my master's degree in education. I've spent time teaching in all different kinds of classrooms. And I understand the desire to protect children so that they can just focus on math and not worry about these issues. And I get that. I think that that's a really valid concern. I think sometimes we have to look at what feels good today and what is going to benefit them and the community tomorrow. And I think raising a generation of students who see that the priority for getting into a math class is figuring out, am I Black or am I Hispanic or am I not allowed in this group? Well, that I feel like is a step in the wrong direction. And so even though I understand, I think the heart behind this a little bit, because people, have been screaming, it's Jim Crow all over again. And I really don't think it is. It's it's impossible to not see the parallels, but I don't think that that is the intent behind it. But I think even something that may be well intended can have terrible consequences later on. And our country is already so divided that I can't see the benefit in teaching children to divide themselves for math class based on how they look and their experiences. I think that's a step in the wrong direction. But let me know what you think. I'm sure there's plenty of you guys who disagree with me, and I welcome the dialogue. And make sure you grab that download, and we will talk soon.